this video, I'm going to show you a very unique modern pen that I think will be of particular interest to three categories of people. The first are those who are interested in a pen that works with shellac-based ink that would instantly clog a fountain pen. The second are those that are in need of a pen that will not leak under any circumstance. The third are those who are convinced that vintage flex pens are superior to modern flex, but are afraid to employ an old, frail pen for everyday use. Here it is. This is the Boston Safety Pen made by Noodlers, and I'm pleased to report that though it does have a few significant drawbacks, which we'll of course discuss, the versatility, practicality, and affordability of this pen make it a very appealing option, particularly for artists in search of yet another flex pen to draw with. I'm going to talk about the pen body itself, and then I'll talk about the small and simple yet completely transformative modification that makes it much, much better. This rather odd-looking pen is a modernized version of a popular design that is over 120 years old, and in fact, vintage safety pens are still widely available online. When you open the pen, you find that the nib is retracted into the barrel and is exposed by pushing in the back like so. To cap the pen, you have to retract the nib, and there's a little metal rod in the cap which prevents you from accidentally bending the nib if you try recapping with the nib still exposed. The biggest advantage of the system, and why this is called a safety pen, is that the cap screws directly into the barrel, forming an airtight seal. This unique design makes it the ultimate portable pen. This is a pen that I can shake, throw into a bag, stick into my pocket, and also take on an airplane without the slightest worry. And I have quite a few fountain pens, and the only ones that have this degree of safety are pens that have mechanisms that seal off the main ink reservoir, such as the Pilot 823 or the TWSBI VAC 700. The second advantage is that the nib and feed, when retracted, are immersed in the ink, which means that there is no risk of drying out. You can have this pen sitting for months, and provided that there's enough ink in the pen to keep things wet, it'll start without any problems at all. Because the nib and feed are kept soaking in ink, and there's no risk of drying out, it means that you can use this pen with inks that would quickly ruin a fountain pen, such as the shellac-based inks intended for dip pens. Such inks are in many ways superior to fountain pen inks because they dry faster, are more viscous, and more waterproof. In fact, many artists shun fountain pens and prefer the dip pen for this very reason. With this pen, you can finally have your cake and eat it too. All the convenience and portability of a fountain pen, and the better performance of waterproof dip pen ink. I really love this design. For one thing, the pen body is made of ebonite, a vulcanized hard rubber, which is very common in old pens, and that combined with its old-timey design give it a really beautiful vintage look. Ebonite, by the way, is a very tough material, and you can still find ebonite pens well over 100 years old in excellent condition. Furthermore, it's also very resistant to all kinds of solvents that might be present in waterproof dip pen inks, such as alcohol. The material feels quite nice in the hand, smooth but not slick like plastic or resin, and with a touch of give to it. The ebonite, combined with the metal parts in the sliding mechanism, give this pen quite a bit of weight and a substantial feel. I would say with the exception of the clip, which admittedly looks a little bit cheap, this feels like a high-quality pen. Everything feels very solidly built, from the way it posts to the satisfying smoothness of its sliding mechanism. It's well balanced and feels quite comfortable in the hand. Okay, now on to the drawbacks. This is a pen that definitely takes a little bit of getting used to. When you unscrew the cap, you're in effect exposing the reservoir, and if you don't remove the cap with the pen upright, the ink will pour out of the pen and instantly into your pants. Look, that's easy enough, you think, and I won't make that mistake, but if you're used to quickly uncapping your pens and are as scatterbrained as I am, accidents are bound to happen. So far so good, but I imagine at some point there will be spillage. Now, I don't think this is a deal breaker by any means. Fountain pen people, after all, are used to getting ink everywhere, and might even secretly enjoy it. But here's another drawback. Before you uncap the pen, particularly if the pen has been shaken or has been facing nib down, you have to tap at it a little bit and wait a few seconds for the ink to flow past the nib and feed down into the reservoir. Otherwise, you risk that a bubble of ink will continue existing on the nib and feed and will pour out of the barrel when you extend it. Again, easy enough, but it's one more thing to be careful of. The main problem here is that this is definitely not a pen that you can cap and uncap quickly. So if you need a pen for note-taking, or you're one of those really fidgety people who's constantly capping and uncapping your pen, this is definitely not a pen for you. Here's another possible drawback, not for me, but for some. This is an eyedropper filling pen, which is fueled through the opening in the barrel, like so. I personally love eyedroppers. For one thing, you can ensure a full fill, You can also make use of an entire ink bottle, and for me, it's the cleanest filling method. Furthermore, in this pen, you don't have to wait for the ink to saturate the nib and feed like the other eyedroppers. Unlike many eyedroppers, however, the ink capacity in this one is just so-so. The recommended fill is a little bit over 1 milliliter, and you have to be careful not to overfill the pen since you can't see how much ink is in it. And if you put in too much ink, it'll spill out when you extend the nib. 1 milliliter isn't bad, however, considering that a universal cartridge is at about 7 milliliters, and it'll definitely get you through a long drawing session without any problems at all. Another possible drawback is that this design requires you to take the pen apart in order to clean it thoroughly. This is particularly important if you plan on using it with dip pen ink. Nathan Tardif, the owner of Noodlers, has a long detailed video on the operation of this pen that I strongly recommend you watch, where he easily disassembles and reassembles this pen with no other tool than his fingers. I, unfortunately, was not able to do so. A number of commenters on his video had the same experience, dip pen ink into it. Okay, so you might be thinking, this is a neat looking pen, but so what? So what that you can throw this pen in a bag or take it on an airplane? There are several vacuum fillers that can do that and have 4 times the ink capacity. So what that you can put dip pen ink into this thing? Nowadays there are plenty of waterproof inks that work perfectly well in fountain pens. So what that it's made of ebonite? That used to be a rarity in modern pens, but that material is making a comeback and there are plenty of them on the market. Furthermore, it's not like I can't go on eBay and in a minute or two get myself a vintage ebonite pen. I have to remember to hold this pen upright when I uncap it? Forget it. Well, there's one other terrific feature which we haven't yet discussed, one that makes this pen absolutely drool-worthy. It's the nib. Now, I hear you chortling dismissively through your screens. You're probably thinking to yourself, really? The nib? Noodler's nibs are awful. But before you turn this video off, let me explain why the nib in this pen is so darn unique and why the nib alone makes this pen so worthwhile. Here's the original nib in a Noodler's Creeper, and it's not much to speak of, pretty scratchy and with relatively poor flex. But the fact that it's so small, only 6 millimeters wide and 25 millimeters long, gives it a unique advantage. It's exactly the same size as a relatively inexpensive, pretty commonly found number 2 vintage gold flex nib. That means that you can very easily switch out the original nib with a nib that's absolutely remarkable. And that's exactly what I've done. In this pen is a vintage number 2 gold semi-flex nib made by Parker with excellent snapback and the ability to produce wonderful line variation. And because this pen has an ebonite feed that provides very generous flow, it should work perfectly. Let's give it a try. Now, one great source for vintage nibs is a company called 5 Star Pens, which sells vintage pens and fountain pen parts and has fantastic customer service. I received my nib within 4 days of purchase. Most of the nibs they sell will run you under $60, though you'll have to pay a little more for the much desired extra flex ones or ones that are in pristine conditions. Their listings usually give the exact measurements of the nib, and you need to look for ones that are 6 millimeters wide by 25 millimeters long. Number 2 Watermans are some of the best, but quite a few other brands such as Parker have nibs of the same size. Be patient. Flex nibs are in high demand and go quickly, but with a little bit of time you should be able to get yourself one. Is this the only pen you can put a vintage nib into? No. But other than the Noodler's Creeper, which is a tiny, sort of uncomfortable pen, this is, as far as I know, the only modern pen that actually takes that widely available number 2 nib. And while there are other vintage nib sizes, such as number 5s and number 6, that might fit into other pens, those nib sizes are not nearly as common and considerably more expensive. For example, if you go to 5 Star Pens, you'll see that the majority of nibs they sell are either number 2 or very close in size, and the larger ones are quite scarce and expensive. Okay, I'm going to do a little drawing with this pen, and while I'll discuss why I think putting a vintage nib into a modern pen is such a great thing to do. So, what is the point of putting a vintage nib into a modern pen when I can just buy a vintage pen with a vintage nib? Well, consider the price. A Boston safety pen is about $55, and assuming you spend another $50 on the nib, that puts us a little bit over $100. For that price, you'll be hard-pressed to find a vintage pen in good working order, never mind one with a flexible nib. Even if you do spend more, what you'll get is a pen that's usually on the smaller side, that's probably quite fragile, definitely not a pen that you'll feel comfortable using and abusing. So, while I adore my vintage pens and use them a lot, their price and fragility is definitely a problem and gives the Boston safety pen a significant edge. This thing is relatively cheap and built like a tank, and this is not a pen I need to baby and worry about. Okay, so now you might be asking, well, why don't I just get myself a modern flex pen? Well, yeah, the inexpensive steel flex pens from Noodlers and Fountain Pen Revolution are wonderful, but you really can't compare them to vintage flex. And the only thing that starts approaching it are the much more expensive pens made by Pilot. The cheapest option, the Pilot Falcon, doesn't come close to the same degree of flex, and the Pilot 912 FA, which is a fantastic pen, considered to be very close to vintage flex, usually clocks in at around $250. And the reality is, modern flex is different than vintage flex. I'll have to make a separate video on the subject at some point, but vintage flex is usually more springy, meaning that the tines snap back from flex to closed much faster than in modern flex, which creates a more elegant calligraphic line. I love my sturdy, reliable, and practical Pilot flex pens and use them probably far more than my vintage flex pens, but vintage is definitely better. I haven't spoken about the working properties of this Parker nib at length because it's very unlikely you'll end up buying one just like it. In fact, one of the fantastic things about vintage pens in general, and one of the main reasons why people like them so much, is that there's a tremendous amount of variety. Pen manufacturers in the first half of the 20th century made many kinds of nibs. Nibs with just a touch of flex, semi-flex, close to full flex, super flex, etc. For example, I own 3 early Watermans, each with a flexible number 2 nib, and all of them are wonderfully different, having their own unique character. So, in conclusion, yes, there are plenty of things that make this pen a bit of a pain in the butt. But if you're looking to combine the durability of a modern pen with the working properties of a vintage nib, and need a pen that won't leak into your pockets, a pen that can be used with a large variety of inks, even dip pen ink, this is a terrific, relatively affordable option. Thanks for watching, and as always, if you have any comments or questions, leave them below, and I'll do my best to reply.